Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Achmoody, and I'm a 1977 graduate of Georgia State University. I was a reporter and editor at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for almost 30 years. Dean Jeff Steele asked me to moderate this discussion because, in addition to being a member of the Library Board of Advocates, I wrote a book called The Class of '65, a story of the civil rights passage in Southwest Georgia, that revolves around a group of high school students who horribly mistreated one of their classmates and reached out to him decades later to apologize and ask for forgiveness. Apologies are tricky. We're fortunate tonight to have a Georgia State professor with us who has studied the ethics of apology and can help us make sense of this complicated subject. Andrew I. Cohen is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Jean Bear Blumenfeld Center for Ethics at Georgia State University. He teaches in ethics, political philosophy, social philosophy, and practical ethics. He appears in media and speaks regularly to public and professional groups on topics in applied ethics. He has published on the ethics of friendship, rights theory, political legitimacy, applied ethics, public policy, and recently on reparations for historic injustice. His most recent book is Apologies and Moral Repair: Rights, Duties, and Corrective Justice, published this year by Routledge Press. Welcome, Andrew.
Hey, thanks, Jim. And I want to thank the Georgia State University Library for hosting this event in collaboration with the Decatur Book Festival. And I also want to extend my gratitude to their campus partners, the Center for Studies on Africa and its Diaspora. I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation and talk about apologies and their significance. It seems to be pretty topical. Some people might say this talk of apologies is almost too topical. Some people worry that sometimes apologies are so common that the currency of apologies might be getting a little too cheap. There are executives who dish out many frequent and seeming half-hearted apologies. We all know that celebrities and politicians will often get caught doing something wrong, and then they'll do the same. And in personal life, of course, we're all familiar with how many people give out apologies, sometimes a little too easily, and sometimes with the form of, "I'm sorry if you were offended." But still, I think there's plenty of interest, and I think philosophers have something neat to contribute to this. So I'm going to do some self-promotion here and share a slide showing the cover of my book. And Jim, thanks again for the introduction. So in the book, generally what I'm talking about is what apologies are and how it is that apologies are at least sometimes governed by justice. And I talk about how there might be rights and duties of apologies, even in the context of historic injustice, and how sometimes states and corporations ought to give out apologies. And now we'll come back to us here.
Andrew, most of us know what an apology is and what it isn't. What do apologies mean to a philosophy professor, and why are they interesting to study?
Hey, thanks for that. I'm going to show a couple of slides here. This won't be slides. It's going to be Jim and I talking, but a few that might help to set the context a bit. There are some legendary stories in the news and in American history. Many people might remember the integration of Little Rock High School in 1957. Journalist Will Counts took a series of gripping photos, and this is one that many people might remember. It's showing Elizabeth Eckford wearing the sunglasses, and she's getting heckled by an angry white mob. And behind her, there is a white young lady named Hazel Bryan, and her face is twisted in some really nasty expression. This picture and the events that surround it shaped these young ladies' lives. And in fact, years later, Hazel Bryan, who was then Hazel Bryan Massery, she contacted Eckford to apologize on the phone. And even in the 90s, there was another apology, and Eckford seemed to forgive her. And they became celebrities in a way by showing the possibilities of forgiveness. there are, of course, other stories, some other instances of corporations. Here is the head of the Toyota company apologizing a few years ago for defective parts in their cars. Perhaps more famously, President Bill Clinton apologized for the decades of abuse that the United States government inflicted on Black men during the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. But this practice of apology, or I should say these practices of apology, are not unique to us humans. There are gestures and norms of contrition found elsewhere in the animal kingdom. There are these various ways that we patch up relations after a breach, after some transgression. Now, sure, some of the things that we do are better than others. And no doubt some apologies can't fix everything. And in fact, there are cases where apologies might not be able to fix anything, but they can help those that we transgress. They can also help the transgressors to do better and to be better. They can help us to do what we ought to do. Now I'll bring it on back to us.
Andrew, a big theme of the book is that authentic apologies have to be tethered to a sense of justice. You talk about that a lot in the book. What do you mean by that?
Justice is something that we're all familiar with, and philosophers certainly study that a lot. And it talks about a body of norms that tell us what we owe to one another and what we may demand of one another. And this is something that philosophers can help with because they can understand a little bit what apologies are, what they can be, what they should be, what role they can play as a part of repair for wrongdoing. I mean, one of the things that I do a lot in the book is I talk about history. And many people will talk about how history is bloody and we're really not going to be able to repair all that bloody history unless we somehow change the basic terms of our free society to overcome the past. And one of the things that I'm doing in the book is saying, I'm not really so sure we have to change the basic terms of a free society. I think many of the tools that we've got, many of the moral tools that we've got are plenty to help us to navigate recovery from historic injustice. And I'm particularly interested in these moral tools that might be available to us in a free society to help us to be respectfully accountable to one another as equals. So, Jim, you were asking, what do I mean by apology? I'm a philosopher. I often deal in definitions, but a practice as rich and diverse as apologetics, it's sort of hard to pin down a definition of apology. It's a very complex social phenomena. There are many manifestations of it. There are many ways of doing it. And that's not true. It's not simply true in terms of variations across cultures. There are many variations within cultures. And I think part of what philosophy can do is it can offer a bit of a map of the terrain of apology. And it can help us to know a little bit about what to expect, how to move about this terrain. But as a map, I will freely confess that any account that I'm going to give is going to be incomplete. It's going to be missing some details. So a theory of apology will miss some of that, but I think, and I hope what I'm doing in the book is giving some account of apologies that can talk a little bit about some of its common functions. So I'm going to share just a couple of notes about how I understand what apologies do. So the way I understand apologies, this is how I unpack it in the book, is I talk about them as being something I call corrective offers. So these apologies are corrective. They are ways of trying to fix something that has gone wrong. There are ways of trying to fix some transgression, some wrongdoing. Apologies, I also understand them as being interactions. They are ways of communicating between two parties. Sometimes they're between two individuals, but they can also be between an individual and a group, or a group and an individual, or two groups. Moral emotions are often very importantly bound up with apologies. And one of the things that many typical apologies do is they convey regret. They acknowledge some sort of a a negative attitude towards something that has taken place. And one of the other keys of many typical apologies is they admit culpability. So the person who apologizes typically will say, look, I acknowledge that what I did makes me blameworthy. I acknowledge that I failed to abide by norms that I ought to have abided by. And in doing that, what apologizers will typically do is they acknowledge some feature of the past. They acknowledge in particular that they had transgressed somebody. They didn't just do something wrong. What apologies often do is they acknowledge that somebody wronged another, that there was a wrongdoing that came at another person's expense. So these features that I'm setting out, I don't pretend that all apologies have them or that any apology is going to necessarily have all of these, but I think this is sort of a map of many of the common features that we're going to find that are common among typical apologies. Now I'm going to go back to Jim and me.
Andrew, another big theme in the book is that there can be rights and duties of apology. This might strike many people as interesting, but a little odd. What does it mean to say someone has a right to another's apology? Can you give us examples of that?
Hey, thanks for that. When I'm thinking about rights, I'm thinking of these principles that describe what it is that we may claim of another person. And duties are these features where we are bound to do something. We owe it to another person to behave in certain ways. So when I'm thinking about rights and duties of apology, I'm thinking about there being some sort of a breach, some transgression where there are reasons, and in my view, there are moral reasons to provide some redress to another party. And that party is in a position to claim them. That party can claim them by right. Now, when I'm talking about rights and duties, I'm not talking necessarily about people using force to beat one another up to enforce them. I'm thinking about the ways of understanding what it is that we owe to one another and what it is that we may claim of one another as decent human beings, as accountable equals. So talk of rights and duties are a sort of shorthand for understanding these reasons that we have for behaving in certain ways toward others and for expecting that others provide things to us.
You talk about rights and duties of apology within intimate relationships. What do you mean by that? I mean, don't we reserve talk of rights and duties among intimates to divorce courts?
Hey, thanks for that, Joe. I'm going to share my screen. I've got some graphics to describe this. Let me fast forward here. So many people might be puzzled about how rights and duties of apology can apply in close relationships. And my fine publisher, Routledge, they sent out a crack team of investigators to get actual photos of people who were having arguments. So people might wonder, how is it that intimate persons, people who are in these close relationships, can draw on the tools of apology? So here's a couple arguing. There's another. Obviously, they've had some sort of a tiff. People might be in grave relational trauma. That's my favorite one. They happen to catch them at exactly the right time. So many people will think this is just an abuse of the terms of rights and duties. But I don't think that it is, because we can understand inside a relationship that there are certain expectations that we have of one another, and we can sometimes demand them. Now, the demand doesn't mean that you pick up a weapon and you threaten somebody to extract it from them. It simply means that we are holding one another to certain norms, that we expect them to behave in certain ways. I mean, just think about how even in intimate relations, people can, in a fit of anger, sometimes say very hurtful things. And then the person who is hurt, I think, is then in a position to demand some repair for that, to demand that the person who spoke so horribly mend their relationship. So again, the rights and duties are just shorthands for talking about how it is that we structure the ways that we relate to one another. And now I'm going to move us back away from these arguing persons, back to Jim and me.
You know, Andrew, so many of the apologies that we hear about in the news have to do with companies and government and institutions, but you devote a great deal of the book to analyzing relationships and their role in apologies. Why is that so important? Why did you devote that much attention to it?
Thanks for that, Jim. I guess uh, we're all involved in relationships with one another in various ways. And I think this is true certainly in the sort of paradigmatic cases where, such as the people that I was showing pictures of who are involved in intimate relations, they owe things to one another because of the intimacy that they share and the history that they've got. But we can even understand ourselves as being in relationships of a sort with anybody and everybody. You can think of examples where something happens to you by a stranger who wronged you, and you're bothered in a very particular way. You might come out to your car and you might discover that somebody vandalized your car. And think about how it is that we often respond in those sorts of circumstances. We get indignant because we think that that person or persons who did that to you, they owed it to you not to do that. You deserved better. They ought not to have done that. So I think that is describing a type of relationship. And the relationship that I have in mind here is a feature of what we owe to one another, how we properly relate to one another, even when we're strangers. So the vandal owed it to you not to vandalize your car. And you had a right to expect of that vandal that that person not do that to you. So the talk of relationships is just a way of sort of understanding how it is that we relate to one another and what moral norms are latching onto and understanding how we hold each other mutually accountable.
What about occasions when people don't agree about the relationship they're in and what they owe one another? A misunderstanding about their duties.
This is hard. I'm going to admit that it's really hard. I mean, we know that just from our ordinary experience. Let's think about it in the case of partners who have disagreements about who said what to whom and what was meant by it and things like that. People disagree all the time. They disagree about history. They disagree about the relationships that they're in. They disagree about the significance of the relationships that they're in. This really complicates things. And I, as a philosopher, I have to admit that with humility. And I can't come up with a cookbook. Philosophy is not like that, where it comes up with a recipe and then you're supposed to turn a crank and then everything is all better. It doesn't quite work like that. I think we know from experience that this is complicated and often it involves negotiation among people who are disagreeing with one another. They got to figure it out. And sometimes tragically, they can't. And that's sad. But when they can, they have to reach some sort of a mutual understanding about what they owe to each other and how they ought to behave with and toward one another going forward, and what that means as far as holding each other to account with respect to the past. Does that help? Because I think it's a good question that you're asking, and people will often ask about that. And a lot of my response is just beginning with, this is really hard, and people have to figure it out. And sometimes they don't. I mean, think about it in the case of diplomacy between two different nations. We might recall that China was demanding an apology from the NBA a year or so ago because of some things that were said, and the NBA refused to apologize. Uh, there are different norms, there are different expectations across cultures and even within relationships. So people have to, when they face these disagreements, they have to bring them out into the open and talk about it and figure out if there is some mutually acceptable middle ground where they can chart a path forward. And if they can't, then in a peaceful world, they go their separate ways. So the short answer is it's hard.
It's hard whether it's a country or it's hard whether it's a couple in a relationship.
Right.
Yeah. So, Andrew, your book is featured in this month-long series, which explores how some GSU scholars have provided a unique lens on race and social justice. How does your book address that?
Yeah, I'm grateful to be a part of this series. And a big portion of my book is exploring what it is that we owe to one another and what we can expect of one another in the context of our history, our shared history. History is bloody. The pages of history are just filled with blood and oppression, but it's not just that. And I think this series is a great opportunity to reflect on the enduring significance of history and how it is that we can overcome that if possible, or at least come to terms with it in light of our understandings of what we owe to one another. So I don't think all of history is a bloody mess. I mean, that we're having this conversation today in climate controlled homes via the internet in a reasonably free country, these are all things that our ancestors couldn't have dreamed of, and yet here we are doing that. But the past is always sort of looming, and it's in the background. And we have to sort of imagine that there are cases where it's a real problem, it's a real troublesome problem as far as how it is that people can relate to one another. So that's part of what my book is up to.
Let's talk about the biggest apology out there, which is reparations. The book talks about apology as a form of reparations. You can use that word, of course, in a broader philosophical sense, which you're doing, but it also has a very specific application in American history. What are reparations to a philosophy professor, and how can apologies be part of that?
All right, thanks. I think I may even have a bullet point about this. Let's see. One moment, please. We'll come back to Dennys in a moment here. Yes, apologies as a form of reparation. So this is something that's getting a lot of conversation about. And I want to tip my hat to the late John Conyers, who was introducing a resolution in Congress. Every session of Congress, he was introducing this resolution to form a commission to study the possibility of reparation as a public policy. And it didn't really ever go anywhere. When philosophers are talking about reparation, they're thinking of it as a form of corrective justice. They're thinking of it as a way of acknowledging how a transgression took place and figuring out how it is that the transgression can be fixed. So in cases of reparation, we're imagining a situation where one person wronged another, or I should say more broadly, one party wronged another. And in cases of reparation, we're imagining a situation, we're thinking about cases where a transgressor owes reparation to victims, owes some repair to victims. And that repair, that correction, it can take a whole bunch of different forms. It can take straightforward compensation. It can also take the form of some intangible form of repair, such as apologies. And what these might mean are going to depend on the details of a particular situation. So when I'm thinking about reparation, I'm thinking about it as a way of getting people what they are due because they were wronged. That often involves compensating them for material damages, but sometimes material damage is not at all what's involved. I mean, think about cases where we might have arguments with our partners and they hurt us. In typical well-functioning relationships, we don't fix that by just buying the aggrieved partner, a new car. What we do is we apologize. Sometimes there may be some material compensation that's involved as well, but often the intangible forms of repair, the apologies, which acknowledge that some wrong was done and pledge some correction going forward, these are ways of helping to mend the past. So in the case of this series, a big theme of the reparation that we're talking about is looking at history, but I think it also broadly encompasses any case involving transgressions. I'm going to come back to Jim and me.
Andrew, are you saying, do you think the United States government has unsatisfied duties of apology to the descendants of enslaved African Americans? And which descendants would you be talking about? Why do they have rights to an apology from the U.S. government? And what does that even mean? How would that work?
Yeah, I think there's I think there are good arguments in favor of saying that the U.S. government owes some form of reparation for slavery. I do not know what form that can take. Many people are familiar with the stories of how there were promises made to the freed slaves at the end of the Civil War. They would get some sort of land and beasts to help them to farm the land, and that never came about. And as we all know, the depredations of slavery didn't end with the end of the Civil War. It continued for decades after, and it's continuing now in many respects. It continued through the Jim Crow era, and it continues in other ways. So the United States government is importantly culpable for these harms because it allowed for slavery, it promoted slavery, it profited from slavery, and there are persons today whose situations are they're in a situation of disadvantage that I think can plausibly be traced to the enduring legacy of slavery. Now, what does it mean to say that the U.S. should apologize, and what does it mean to say there are duties to apologize? I certainly don't pretend that an apology is going to fix everything. You can't, because the people who were victimized by slavery, many of them are dead, and you can't repair the dead. But what you can do is take a look at any enduring injustices that might be traced to shortfalls on the part of the United States. So in actual public policy terms, I'm a philosopher. I can't really prescribe what it is that people can do. This requires serious conversation among persons who are familiar with the details of public policy and are aware that there are opportunity costs in anything that the government might do. But plausibly, I think that the U.S. government may owe an apology to Blacks for its role in supporting and perpetuating slavery and racist institutions thereafter. The government ought not to have done that. It owed it to Black persons not to do that and not to enable their continued oppression. And it did it anyway. It owed it to Blacks not to deprive them of the opportunity to own property and own businesses and be full and equal members of a society that we live in. And the government failed Blacks by not providing that. So the apology is not going to fix all of that. But what the apology can do as part of a larger program of reparations, it can help people to begin to come to terms with the past. It can help be one step in the US government acknowledging that it failed to do what it ought to have done. And it can show that it is committed to acknowledging Black persons as civil, moral, social, and economic equals going forward. It's hard, again, and I'm going to admit that. Sorting out these details is going to be very difficult. But what I think the philosopher can do in these circumstances is talk about what sorts of arguments there are to support some sort of a measure of official apology. By the way, this is hardly unprecedented. The United States did that. I showed earlier that picture of Clinton apologizing for Tuskegee. Reagan apologized to the Japanese and Aleuts who had been put into concentration camps in the United States during World War II. So there are cases where the United States government has acknowledged what it has done, but many people are waiting for it to do that.
Andrew, what do you say? What do you say to people who who say, "Well, my ancestors never owned slaves. My grandparents came in through Ellis Island. We had nothing to do with this. Why? The apology's fine, but if we get into material recompense, they're going to say, why should that come out of my hide?" What's the moral argument? What would you say to them?
Yeah, that's a really important challenge to any program of reparations or apologies, where people will say, look, just as you're saying, Jim, I wasn't involved. My grandparents didn't do anything, so why can't we just let bygones be bygones? There are many scholars and others who will point out that that's somewhat of an oversimplified account of history in the United States, that persons who are alive now, white or Black, are all sort of inheriting this legacy of the unsatisfied situation of slavery and Jim Crow. And there are some scholars who offer arguments that I think are quite compelling, that many white persons who can be, just like you described, saying, my ancestors got off the boat, why should I be doing anything? In some respects, they might be complicit in the perpetuation of the enduring slavery, the enduring legacy, I should say, of slavery. One thing that might help, let me share a little bit, a neat picture that might indicate what I've got in mind with this. Let me fast forward a little bit here. There are arguing persons again. We'll come back to Jim. So it might help to understand how I'm thinking about apologies and reparations and when they matter and when they don't matter by thinking about a case where they don't matter. Here's a picture. This is a fellow named Patrick Lavin, and he was a New York City cop in the late 1800s. His great-great-grandson, a guy named Terrence Lavin, he grew up in his family knowing the legend of this great-great-grandfather, Patrick, as a very accomplished policeman in his day. So what Terrence Lavin did a couple of years ago is he did some digging and he discovered something. It turns out that this guy pictured here, Patrick Lavin, was part of a corrupt bunch of cops. And one day in 1889, Patrick and his partner were shaking down a saloon owner. So Patrick's partner went into the bar to collect, and then Patrick was standing guard outside. And then a brawl broke out inside the saloon. So this fellow pictured here, Lavin, tried to get past a suddenly locked door by pummeling it and banging on it. Meanwhile, the building's janitor was a guy named Casper Faust. And this Casper Faust guy had recently come to the United States from Germany. So Faust heard all of the racket and confronted Lavin with a club. And then these two guys started fighting with one another. Now, the details on what happened after that are a little murky, but what is pretty clear is that their fight spilled into the yard as Casper Faust's wife was screaming for them to stop. And then Patrick Lavin, this cop pictured here, then proceeded to bludgeon Casper Faust to death. And Lavin was later indicted on manslaughter, but after years of delay and years of corruption, the DA dismissed all the charges and Lavin went on to live happily ever after. Now, what's all interesting about this? Terrence Lavin went digging and he found a descendant of Casper Faust living nearby in the New York metropolitan area. They met at the site of the murder. And here is a picture of them meeting. So there they are. This is all from the New York Times. It came out a couple of years ago. Here are these two white guys, and Lavin, the guy in the white shirt there, is gesturing as if to show where the fight took place. And you could see there on the left, there's Stephen Faust II, who is the descendant of the man that Terrence Lavin's great-great-grandfather murdered. And they're just standing there at the site of the murder. And I always find it neat looking at this picture that Faust is looking out there, with his hands on his hips, and he's got this sort of amazed look on his face. And now Lavin, writing for the New York Times a couple of years ago, and he concludes his feature article by writing the following. And here's a quote. He wrote, "Where we stood, there is no mark reminding people of the tragedy that occurred there and no need for one," close quote. And I think he's spot on. No one had been thinking or brooding about this 19th century murder. It wasn't part of the story that the Faust family rehearsed and relived daily. It's not an emblem of any enduring unjust hardship. It was this isolated episode. Life went on. And we can even imagine that after this picture was taken, Lavin and Faust went out to go get a beer, and then they went their separate ways. This is not a model of what's going on today. Instead, we live in a world that is marked by the legacy of chattel slavery. The injustices of centuries of depredations, they live on and they matter. They shape people's identities. Bygones are not bygones. And, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, there are certainly distinct features of the history of the United States, but this is hardly the only case of historic injustice awaiting repair in the United States or elsewhere. Bygones aren't bygones for Armenians waiting for some sort of recognition for the Armenian genocide, for the Kurds, for indigenous groups in so much of the West and in Taiwan and South Asia and elsewhere, and all sorts of minority and stateless groups. Those are the historic injustices that matter. These are the ones that people are aggrieved about. Now we're coming back to Jim and me. So this is what I find really compelling, that many of these injustices are enduring and people are trying to figure out how we can remain mutually accountable to one another, how we can acknowledge the past and how people can get what they are due. And part of what they are due, as I talk about in the book, is recognition for the wrongs and recognition as equals, as mutually accountable to one another.
Well, the one with the New York Times writer strikes me as being a pretty easy one.
Right.
I mean, what happened? What happened to the other guy's ancestor was really horrible, but he didn't even know about it.
Exactly.
He had never even heard the story, so that's a pretty easy apology to posit. Some of these others are monstrously difficult to contemplate. Let's talk about another type of apology that we see in the news all the time, and that's corporate apologies. Companies are presented with horrible things that have happened on their watch all the time, and some of them handle it well and some of them don't. Can you ever trust a corporate apology knowing that there's probably some profit motive behind what they're saying?
Yeah, this is a good challenge to the possibility that corporate groups, especially for-profit corporate groups, can apologize. I can put the Dennys thing back up, but we can just talk about it. Everybody's familiar with the Dennys restaurants throughout the United States, and there was this pretty noted case in the 1990s in the United States where numerous Dennys franchises were having their employees treat persons of color inappropriately. They were treating them like garbage, and many people were getting really upset about that. Jim Adamson was at the time head of the parent company of Dennys, which was called Advantica. And he took over he was the head of the corporation, and he recognized that there was serious mismanagement and a really problematic culture going on in Dennys. So he took it upon himself to shake up the corporation and to engage in processes to reform the corporation, to apologize. And I think the apology and the reform was pretty successful. Was Jim in it for the money? Yeah, partly. But I think there is some sort of sincerity going on there. We have to understand when we're asking for contrition from corporations, we can't realistically expect, nor can the corporation provide corporate tears of shame or corporate gnashing of corporate teeth. What you can get is a guy like Jim Adamson having some press conferences and saying, what Dennys did was wrong. What our employees did was despicable, and we should do better. We can do better, and we're going to do better. And he reformed the corporation. I'm not a shill for Dennys, by the way. I just read up on this, and I think he did a pretty good job. But many of us are familiar with other cases that don't go so well. There was that case a couple of years ago where a gentleman was dragged off and pummeled from a United Airlines aircraft. And what followed was a series of sort of half-hearted apologies on the part of the airline executive leadership. And eventually they finally got to what they needed to do. Now, initially, obviously, they're just engaged in damage control and they're trying to protect their bottom line. But part of doing that well, part of being a responsible corporate citizen is acknowledging that they are accountable under certain moral norms. They shouldn't be treating people like garbage. So whether it's Dennys or United Airlines or British Airways a couple of years ago, which had a massive data breach, these corporate officials who run the places ought to, they're in a position to, and they ought to acknowledge that they failed to do what they ought to have done, that they owe it to the persons that they transgressed to do better. And the people, I think, are correct in expecting that. So when we expect more of our corporations, I hope we don't expect to see corporations crying. I don't even know what that would look like. What does it look like when Dennys cries? Maybe you can see particular people on the board of directors getting really sort of verklempt about things. But what we want is for the corporation to have various spokespersons officially empowered to stand up there and say, we can do better and we ought to have done better and we're very sorry. And I think states can do the same thing. Clinton's apology for Tuskegee, I think, was a pretty good job at acknowledging how horrifically the United States government treated the men of Tuskegee. It doesn't erase the wrong. Apologies can't do that. Apologies can't fix everything. Let me show an example of this. I'll share my screen here. Here's a fairly recent case dating back to a horrific historic injustice. The lady that's pictured here, her name was Rosie Taylor, and it's a real sad story because it was one of many where whites brutalized blacks and got away with it. Ms. Taylor was brutally raped in Abbeville, Alabama by 7 white men in 1944. She was later able to identify some of her attackers. And then there were 2 all-white juries that failed to indict these guys, despite confessions by one of them. A book was written about this in 2011. And then following that, there were a whole bunch of apologies. The mayor of Abbeville, Alabama, apologized for the town's failure to protect her. The state of Alabama, the legislature, apologized and expressed profound regret that the state didn't do better. And they actually called the state's inaction from 1944 morally abhorrent and repugnant. Now, again, I don't pretend that these apologies erase history. They don't unrape. That's just this horrific conceptual confusion. But what they can do is they can vindicate Rosie Taylor as a human being to whom different treatment was owed. They can publicly convey how Taylor and many people like her are worthy of respect as equals, as persons who can demand an account from us. And what these apologies can do is they can be some steps that can offer to retract the denigrating messages that any earlier acts may have sent. So the idea that I have is this is some step toward improving things. I'm going to bring us back to Jim and me.
So you think the state of Alabama and the local governments handled that reasonably well. Can you think of other examples where corporations or institutions have tried to apologize for something or at least consider an apology and they just mucked it up?
Oh, this happens all the time. I mean, the United Airlines case that I was mentioning was a good one. And there are many cases of state entities that have failed to do what they ought to have done. The horrible history between Japan and Korea regarding the so-called comfort women and the apologies or non-apologies that were going back and forth between these two countries are good examples of how it sometimes is a very clumsy affair and sometimes half-hearted apologies make things worse. So it's really easy to get this wrong. It's very hard to get it something close to right. And what that involves is often really complex, and it involves some sort of a conversation between the wrongdoer and the person who is wronged as a way of figuring out how together they can chart a path forward that's mutually acceptable.
That's an important part of it, isn't it, for the person who is transgressed to offer an account of the transgression and admit to it. And that sometimes can be the toughest thing for somebody to do in making an apology is to actually talk about what happened.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. I mean, this is part of why it is so difficult for us, right? We're admitting that we failed. We're admitting that we didn't live up to standards that we hold ourselves to, and uh, we're supplicating ourselves to the persons that we've harmed. We give them certain powers over us when we apologize. It's a power to forgive. It's a power to accept our interpretation of the past, a power to accept our request to move forward or not. And people can refuse it. There's some really good philosophy that talks about the forgiveness that people might give or might withhold, and how and whether morality might govern that. That's another really complicated affair. But yeah, I agree. It's very hard for people to do this, and it sometimes is something that we don't succeed at. We regularly don't succeed at it.
We had a question from somebody here about if you could come up with an example of a government or an institution effectively apologizing for a historic injustice. It sounds like we've already named one. It sounds like you think the Tuskegee study apology was handled pretty well. There's another one you have in your slideshow that I'd like you to talk to that's along these lines, and that's Georgetown University, which it came out a few years ago was complicit in the slave trade.
Absolutely.
Talk about that a little bit. It's an interesting case.
It is, yeah. So there's a stock photo of Georgetown University and some of its lovely buildings. Uh, this is a case that many of us might be familiar with, and it's perhaps, I might say, a model of how a university might begin to approach its troubled past. For those of us who are in this part of Georgia, many of us might be familiar with how the University of Georgia has discovered the remains of slaves on its grounds and has had some uneven responses to that. And many people are not entirely happy about how that university has handled it. But Georgetown is another sort of case. And this goes back to a case in the early 19th century. In 1838, the Maryland Jesuits, who were then supporting what was then Georgetown College, they sold 272 slaves because Georgetown College was in such financial trouble. And now, just over the past couple of years, Georgetown has gone through a whole lot of self-study, and it's still doing this, where it's talked about the extent of its involvement in that slave trade. And what Georgetown researchers did is they actually identified some of the surviving descendants of the slaves that were sold to a plantation in Louisiana. And what they've now done is they've explored a whole bunch of different measures to try to repair that extremely complicated and unjust past. They've suggested some actual reparations, helping out some of the descendants with opportunities to get into college, some sort of scholarship fund. They are exploring other measures, some historic self-study where you can recognize the past. So these apologies and these various measures, they don't erase what happened. They don't unenslave the persons that Georgetown sold, but they can be really important parts of the repair that people might claim. And they can also be an important part of repair that is due them. It acknowledges them as equals who can demand that people treat them with respect. And now I'll bring it back to Jim and me.
Andrew, we have a question here about the difference between group apologies and individual policies. What considerations come into play for a group apology by a company, by a government, to be effective when compared to an apology by or behalf of an individual?
Good. Yeah, group apologies are complicated because you've got a whole bunch of different minded persons, and often they don't completely agree. So when figuring out how a group apology works, we have to imagine that it's an organized group, that it's not just some random group of redheaded persons. We're talking about some sort of an incorporated or organized group, and they've got some governing norms where they can figure stuff out. They can make decisions as a group. So Georgetown University is a corporate entity of a sort. There are people that run the place, and these people are endowed with various powers according to the Articles of Incorporation for Georgetown University to speak on its behalf, to represent the university, to do things. So I guess what I'm thinking here to the questioner is groups need to abide by their governing norms, and those governing norms can tell us how an utterance that's coming from a group counts as a group apology. So in the case of, say, a political entity, it's got to go through a deliberative body, a legislative body. You can have particular politicians that might express regret, but in the case of the United States, for instance, no one politician on their own is in a position to apologize for what the United States did until it's actually gone through some sort of deliberative discussion. The legislature would need to approve it. So the Conyers resolution that hadn't gone anywhere for many years, we could imagine something happening that's modeled on what happened with Tuskegee or the World War II reparations for the Japanese and Aleut internment. Congress discusses this, they debate it, they pass a resolution, the president signs it, and maybe the president can deliver it. This doesn't ignore that there are people who don't agree with it. I mean, this certainly happened with the reparations for the internment of the Japanese and the Aleuts. There were people in Congress who voted against it. But still, the apology that came out of that was an official apology by the United States government because they were doing it according to the norms that govern the country. When it comes to a single person, it's a little cleaner because all you have to do is just look at the person and explore what's this person thinking? What is this person committing to? With groups, it gets always more complicated.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, do you have any particular apology out there in the world that you would most fondly like to see made?
There are so many, and this is potentially a danger. And I can imagine some people worrying that this just becomes a vehicle of cultivating sort of a grievance industry. But I think understood appropriately, it's a way of understanding what we owe to one another and how we can be better for one another and how we can treat one another as mutually accountable equals. The slavery, the situation of unredressed American slavery, I think, is an enduring one, and I think it would be a good thing for the United States to come to terms with that very complicated history. And it's hardly going to be easy, and it's going to take a long time to figure out how best to go about doing that. That's beyond my pay grade, figuring out how precisely to do it.
Amen on that one, incidentally. Well, here's a question. I'm just looking at it for the first time. I'll read it to you.
Sure.
You referred to apologizing as conferring power on the person being apologized to. How do we think about the idea of being openly unapologetic then? Is there a way of then maintaining power? Is that a way then of maintaining power? Thinking of personal power, but also institutional and governmental power, leaders actively refusing to apologize for bad acts or harmful policies, question mark. So I think that question has to do, what do you do when somebody is just totally unapologetic, an institution or a person?
There are bad people. I mean, this will sound sort of extremely bland and trite. There are jerks in our midst, and some of these jerks are horrifically unjust persons, and things aren't always going to get better. This is hardly a panacea to cure all of our ills. So sometimes people will not do what they ought to do. We're all familiar with that. There are different ways of trying to exhort them or encourage them to be better. And I think many of us are familiar with this, these various informal ways of getting people to fess up to what they did. There are informal pressures. Social media does this all the time, sometimes for ill and sometimes for good. But we do this in our own personal lives as well, where we're familiar with how acquaintances may have behaved in a less than stellar way, right? And we can sort of encourage them, you really ought to apologize to him because that wasn't such a great thing to do. And for people who just refuse to do that, then we don't have to associate with them anymore. So we have it within our power, third parties, to say, you know what, I wasn't really too excited about what went on over there. I'm not going to be hanging out with that person anymore. And these are just, I'm talking about small scale slights. In larger scale situations, which is what I think the questioner is asking about, I think this is a good point. Institutions and persons, they're reluctant to give up that power. They're reluctant to come to terms with the things that they did that treated others disrespectfully and wrongly. What do? We pressure them. We hope that they do better, and we hope that they'll come to terms with it. They might not, but sometimes they do. Sometimes we get better. sometimes we can improve and we can take some steps to mending the past. And that can improve the situation of persons who were wronged, persons who were liked, persons who were like the ones who were wronged. And it can also help the transgressors to become better persons and improve their relationships with others.
Andrew, it occurs to me that you must be a curator of bad apologies. Do you have any that are at the top of the list, maybe in recent culture, that you think were just so lame that they stick in your head?
This is a somewhat dated one, but for those of you who were born before the Nixon administration, there was a fairly famous non-apology by Bob Packwood, who was a senator out from the Pacific Northwest, and many people started to allege that he had engaged in various forms of sexual misconduct, and the things that he said after these allegations came to light were hilariously bad. It's actually not funny because there were women who were harmed by his behavior, but the lame effort at apology that he had were just hilarious when he would say, I am apologizing. This is a paraphrase. I'm apologizing for the behavior that it is alleged that I did. I think that's pretty close to what he said at one point. That's just hilariously bad. But in the book, I talk about some other more recent cases of really successful ones. There's this good case involving the defunct sitcom called Community that appeared on network TV a couple of years ago. And there's a famous case where a producer was behaving really inappropriately toward one of his writers. Megan Gans, one of the writers. And as time went on, the producer, I think his name was Harmon, actually apologized to Gans, first sort of half-heartedly on Twitter, but then eventually he got onto a podcast and spent 7.5 minutes in this monologue of abject contrition that Megan Gans then publicly on Twitter said, that's a masterclass in apologizing. She accepted his apology because he completely acknowledged what he had done, acknowledged that he had mistreated her, acknowledged that she deserved better, and acknowledged that his behavior is part of a pattern of men treating women like garbage. And she was impressed with that. So I think that's a case where people can acknowledge that they can do better, and in the process of acknowledging they do better, and they extend to people that they've wronged some of the treatment that they're properly due.
We all have to learn how to do this. It's not a thing that we're born with. And apparently he had his education in public, and I'm glad it worked out that way. Andrew, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for this discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight at this presentation from the Georgia State Library.
Hey, it's my pleasure. And before we go, I just wanted to put up some of Jim's great books. For those of you, he mentioned his Class of 65 book, and I'm showing this up on the screen now. And Jim has this outstanding book that talks about the history of barbecue. So please go check them out. And again, I want to thank the organizers for this. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm gonna bring it back to Jim so we can see each other. Thank you so much, Jim, for this and for the organizers. And thanks to the questioners for their great queries. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.